Hey everyone, and welcome to another Kano Reviews, where we review games both new and old on all platforms. If you like the content that I make, then please subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell so you never miss a review when it comes out. Today we talk about the game Kane and Lynch Dog Days, the sequel to the first Kane and Lynch game. Much like its predecessor, Dog Days received its fair share of controversy in terms of how it portrayed its violence, but yet again got slammed overall by reviews and was yet another financial flop. I wasn't too fond of the first Kane and Lynch game, but did want to give this sequel a go as well to see if they had improved on some things, and luckily, the game was only 99 cents during a Steam sale, a price that I already can say is definitely worth the price of the game despite me having a lot of problems with it. But even then, a price of less than $1 is of course a no-brainer. So without further ado, let's dive deeper into this mess of a game. So the story of Kane and Lynch Dog Days takes part some time after the first game, where Lynch, the balding psychopath, has settled in Hong Kong with a nice lady, though he has not thrown away his old habits of working in the criminal circuit. Kane is coming to visit him for a certain deal that's about to go down, and of course that same night he arrives, things already start to go sideways when a simple house visit turns into a violent chase, leaving a seemingly innocent woman dead who turns out to be the daughter of one of the most powerful criminals in Hong Kong. Kane and Lynch then get hunted down and chased by several groups throughout various locations like downtown, construction sites, apartment buildings, and eventually the airport to grab a plane and escape. Though the story is sometimes presented in a very cinematic way, when it comes down to the story itself, it kinda sucks. It literally comes down to Kane accidentally shooting a woman, her dad wants revenge, and thus Kane and Lynch need to steal an airplane to escape Hong Kong. Literally, the ending cutscene is also just 1 minute long or something of you getting on the plane and flying off, thinking to yourself, what even happened in this story? Before talking about the gameplay, we need to talk a bit about the graphics and presentation of this game, because that is very different compared to the first one. So the first Kane and Lynch game was a very ugly game, and luckily they have definitely improved upon this with the sequel, so it's not like everything is bad. The graphics engine itself looks pretty nice with some good lighting and shadow effects and some great particle effects and destruction during certain scenes. However, the issue with this is that despite the graphics might being improved technically, the game actually can look uglier than the first game due to the idiotic decision to add certain filters and screen effects during the gameplay. I criticized Battlefield 3 for having all sorts of crap on your screen like lens flares, glares, water droplets, or simulating dust on a lens when looking into a light. The reason why this is stupid is because it detracts from the actual graphics by having these effects obscure them. Sure, it can make the game look more cinematic, but it doesn't make it prettier necessarily, and if it's overdone, then it can even be obnoxious like in Battlefield 3. Mass Effect 1 is a far better example of having lens flares, but them not being so invasive that they ruin the experience. Dog Days, however, dials this to another 11 like Battlefield, despite this game being released earlier, and the reason why they have so many effects like dust on the camera is because the game is trying to simulate as if it's a snuff film or a handheld footage film or documentary. All of the cutscenes are filmed as if they were handheld, without cuts, as if there was a third person constantly following Kane and Lynch and documenting everything they do. It even goes to the point of focusing and zooming in on certain actions with that typical disorienting camera movement we know from movies like Blair Witch or Wreck. There's for example also an entire cutscene in a car where Kane and Lynch talk to this English bloke, and it's filmed in a way where it seems like the camera is positioned on the back seat, almost like a hidden camera. And on paper, having cinematics like this is not a bad idea. It can even be different, and God of War showcased that it can have a single cut and leave a great impression because of it. Though of course that game never tries to simulate that this single shot is actually done by a real camera. But with Kane and Lynch, the fact that they went for this found footage style creates a big error during the gameplay itself. For starters, the camera shakes all over the place during action parts, and when you sprint, that shaking gets worse and is enough to make anyone motion sick. Now you can turn this off in the options menu, so there is a way around it. But the worst decision in my opinion is to use an artifact filter where during movement there's constant artifacting and pixelation happening, which literally makes the game look uglier than it actually is. It's a little difficult to explain what I exactly mean with the people who are not familiar with the term artifacting, but basically it's that the image creates these squares on the screen when there's an information overload, and it looks like the footage you are watching is in 360p instead of high definition. So if you look at the screen, you have these constant squares popping up the entire time, taking away from the fact that the game itself has been made prettier. Because of this style, I actually think that the game looks uglier than the first game, and it's a horrible, horrible decision. It might sound like a bit nitpicky when I explain it like this, but trust me, it's really obnoxious when you have this the entire game through. On a positive side note, with the notion that this is found footage, they do have something clever where they, for example, pixelate all the nudity, but also explicit gore when you pull off a successful headshot. It creates a nice touch to where it seems like the footage you are watching has already been edited for when it's released to whatever site or platform that will air it for whatever reason. So with the presentation and graphics, the game takes one step forward, but two steps back, unfortunately. Then what about the gameplay? Well, control-wise, the game has been improved with smoother movements, better handling of getting into cover and whatnot. So first impressions could be that this has been improved overall as well. But of course, one issue I had with the first game was that annoying random bullet spread that it had, where aiming and the gunplay itself just felt awful and not fun. With Kane and Lynch 2, they at least tried to be a bit more accurate in conveying how much your bullets will randomly sway, because all the targeting reticules you get are massive. When you pick up a weapon like an Uzi and aim, the crosshair you see is laughable, and I have seen games with shotguns where the crosshair isn't as wide as this. It just makes shooting quite a chore, because so few of the bullets you fire actually go to where you are aiming. And people might whine or defend it by saying that this is to replicate the kickback or the fact that Kane and Lynch are no trained soldiers, but even then they have had years of experience handling firearms, so there really is no excuse there. I have mentioned this already in the first Kane and Lynch review, but a great example of a third-person shooter that does gunplay really well is Spec Ops: The Line. Now, much like with its predecessor, Kane and Lynch Dog Days got to endure its fair share of critique when it came to its portrayal of violence. Multiple women get killed in pretty horrific ways, there's a nasty torture scene, and civilians get frequently caught up in the fire between you and the other thugs. You are not punished in any way, but adds to that raw chaos feeling. I've already talked about this in the first review, but I don't mind this raw approach of the violence, and it honestly does make it seem a bit more like those hard crime movies like Heat or the British film Rise of a Foot Soldier. The British guy you talk to in some cutscenes, for example, is really harsh with his language, and he makes some remarks that definitely cannot fly anymore in today's sensitive day and age. I did think that the script was pretty sharp at times, and his delivery was by far the most convincing, with one particular conversation sticking out to me where he berates one of his lackeys who currently is visiting his mom in the hospital because she has brain cancer, and basically, this British guy is telling him that he doesn't give a damn that his mom is sick. It's the type of writing we don't see a lot in video games, but we do see it more in Hollywood crime movies made by types like Scorsese or Tarantino. It's also very clear that the game takes inspiration from something like the movie Heat, since the final level takes place at an airport, and there's a section near the landing strip that looks exactly like it does in the final scene of Heat. Other than that, you will be fighting plenty of police through the streets as you duck behind cars. Now, even though the gunplay feels bad, the graphics get downgraded by annoying filters, and the story is very lackluster, there are still moments where things click and the action on screen can be pretty enjoyable or fun to look at. I personally think that this has to do with the fairly original setting of it taking place in Hong Kong, and it's always cool to see a game take place in a setting we don't see a lot. Especially those grimy and dirty alleyways, market streets, and dubious shopping centers in Hong Kong make for a really cool backdrop for all the action that takes place. The environmental destruction is also pretty cool, so when the bullets do start flying, it sometimes can be pretty cool to look at. Also, since you don't have that annoying Games for Windows Live, it's much easier to set up a co-op campaign, and if you play this with a friend, the score can at least go up with half a point or so, because it almost is always more fun to play a game together with a buddy. But overall, this game definitely is not worth a full price tag, or even something like $10. The game is very short too, with you easily being able to complete it in less than 2.5 hours. And as mentioned before, for every step it took in the right direction compared to the first game, it takes 2 steps in the wrong one. I was convinced in the beginning I would like this sequel better than the first game, since I liked the setting of Hong Kong, the graphics were better initially, and I assumed that they fixed the annoying gunplay. But in all honesty, I might actually prefer the first game over this one, despite the second half of that first game still being absolute garbage and probably even worse than this game. But at least that first half is original and fun enough to where it sets us apart and it's not ruined by obnoxious filters or even more annoying gunplay with white crosshairs and a story that is nothing to speak of, but at least a bit better than what we get here. When it comes to third-person shooters, there are so many more better options out there. Maybe you can check this out when you've been through all of them, but in the end, Kane and Lynch Dog Days gets a 5.4. This was also the end of the franchise, and I don't think we will ever see it revived. Honestly, both games had some neat and clever ideas or elements, but they were far overshadowed and overlooked by other gameplay elements and aesthetics that ruined it. Luckily, the studio that was responsible for these two games went back to the games that they do best, the Hitman franchise, and luckily, that is one of my favorite franchises out there, so I was very glad to welcome IO Interactive back home.